Thank you very much, Aricia. One of the great pleasures of being here since I took on the challenge to help create the Peter Leahy Leadership College last April is the opportunity to connect with so many remarkable people here in this community. And I was at the Public Policy Forum dinner where Aricia was honored, and it's just been great to connect with her and so many other people in this community. I suppose I should say, honorable guests, honorable senators, distinguished guests, Dean. It's really been great here because when I was elected to Parliament in 1988, my party, the Progressive Conservative Party, actually won all of the seats in Alberta. And one of our colleagues was sworn in on his sickbed. He had a recurrence of an illness, and he died before he was able to come to Ottawa and take up a seat. And then Deborah Gray won the by-election. But at my time in Parliament, I had a great many colleagues, obviously from Alberta, but had never had the opportunity to live here. So being here in Edmonton is really great fun, a chance to renew old acquaintances, but also to come to understand this remarkable community. It really is a great and wonderful place and defies all stereotypes. Alberta is a very complex and interesting part of the world, and I'm having great fun being here. I was saying to a couple of people that I've been traveling for the last week, and when I came back Wednesday night and began to focus on this evening, I thought, my goodness, what was I thinking, agreeing to come and address the issue of Senate reform to this body, this group of people who are either academic experts or yourselves members of that, or former members of the Red Chamber. So I'm going to talk to you about Senate reform, obviously from my own perspective as a recovering politician and somebody who is a battle-scarred veteran of some of the interesting battles having to do with the Senate and how it functions and the challenges for reforming it. For much of our history, the Senate has worked out of the limelight. And one of the interesting things about the Senate is that although it is an integral part of our parliamentary structure, a great many Canadians know very little about it. They don't know how it fits in to our constitutional framework. For people thinking about this issue today, the end of that kind of under-the-radar functioning of the Senate came about with the landslide election of the Progressive Conservatives in 1994. Now, I'm not saying that before World War II there might not have been other situations where Senate and government were at loggerheads, but certainly in the post-war period, the real challenge came when Brian Mulroney won such a landslide victory in 1984, and faced a situation of a Senate that was dominated by the Liberal Party. Now, the Liberal Party has one ideology, and that is to be in government. And I say this not in a partisan way. It's actually been a very good strategy for them, because if you aren't in government, you can't do anything. And I think they were kind of horrified by the 1984 victory, particularly because Brian Mulroney had taken their Quebec vote. And Alan McEachern, who became the Liberal Party leader in the Senate, said, if we can't govern from the House, we will govern from the Senate, which was kind of an interesting perspective. The first major confrontation between the Senate and the government came over the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which the Senate refused to ratify, and this forced an election. And actually, it turned out to be the best thing that they could have done for the government because it guaranteed the re-election of the Progressive Conservative Party. Now, why was that the case? Well, between 1984 and 1988, the coalition which had elected the Conservatives in 1984 had begun to have fissures in it. There was unhappiness in the West. I mean, the famous aircraft maintenance contract was supposed to go to Quebec, go to Manitoba and went to Quebec. There were just a whole lot of issues, and no government can maintain the kind of high that came with that historic majority in 1984. Also, the fact that when you have that many seats in the House, it's often very hard for a government to maintain discipline among its members, and there were some notable breaches of caucus solidarity at that time. But when the Liberals decided that they would force an election on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, and I'll come back to this because I think, in fact, it probably was the kind of issue where it was appropriate for the Senate to take that stand. But actually, Alan McEachern, I think, was probably sure that this was going to mean the defeat of the Conservative government because the last party that had gone to the people of Canada on a policy or platform of reciprocity had lost terribly, and that was Laurier's Liberals in 1911. So it seemed to him probably that this was going to be a way to defeat the government. But in fact, it glued together the coalition that had elected the Conservatives in 1984. Because in the West, the Reform Party was rising, but people in the Reform Party knew that if they voted Reform, it would increase the likelihood that the Liberals would be elected. And Reformers really strongly supported the Free Trade Agreement. And John Turner had actually convinced people that if he was elected, he would abrogate the agreement. Similarly, in Quebec, that soft nationalist vote, people there were very keen to have the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement because they felt that if in some point in the future Quebec was going to become an independent country, that having that relationship with the United States would be a great foundation. So, in fact, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement turned out to be the issue that guaranteed to the Conservatives in 1988, the year that I was elected to Parliament, a return as a majority government. Not quite as large as in 1984, but a very significant majority. And as I say, I think it was an appropriate use of the Senate's veto because the Free Trade Agreement was not part of the Progressive Conservative mandate. And if you remember, even before he became Prime Minister, I think Brian Mulroney had been asked what he thought about free trade with the United States. And he kind of had the same knee-jerk reaction that people often have, but they haven't really looked into the issue. And he said, oh, no, it's a non-starter, you know, they take over us. Actually, when you study free trade agreements, the smaller country in bilateral free trade agreements often gets a disproportionate advantage in those relationships. But what was interesting, of course, was that after he became Prime Minister, I think it was in 1985, the Macdonald Royal Commission reported out. And the Macdonald Royal Commission was the most profound, intense, in-depth analysis of the Canadian economy and polity in probably 50 years, if not longer. And in fact, Roger Gibbons and I were talking, we had a wonderful Professor Alan Cairns, who was one of the, at UBC, who was one of the 3 research directors of that commission. And when the Macdonald Royal Commission reported out, one of its recommendations was that Canada should enter into negotiations with the United States for a free trade agreement. And to give him credit, Brian Mulroney took it very seriously. I mean, this was an incredibly informed study, and its recommendations deserved to be taken seriously. So even though this had come out of a Liberal-created Royal Commission, and that Macdonald himself had been a former Liberal finance minister, I don't think it was necessarily wrong for the Liberals in the Senate to say this was not part of the mandate that was given to the Conservatives in 1984. It is a major departure, therefore they should probably run an election on it. Once the party was re-elected, the Senate passed the free trade legislation without any difficulty. But the second major confrontation came with the goods and services tax, when again the Senate refused to pass the legislation. Now, this time, the government's response was different. It did not need to call an election because they had enough members by now in the Senate so that if the Prime Minister took advantage of that hitherto never used provision of the Constitution that allowed him to appoint either 4 or 8 new senators, he would have enough to pass his legislation. There had been over the intervening time enough opportunities to appoint Conservatives to the Senate. So, but it was interesting that created an enormous controversy. I was Minister of Justice at the time, and so my lawyers were in court defending the constitutionality of the Prime Minister's action. And it was interesting because I was horrified at what the Senate had done, because there had been a convention. I mean, the Senate cannot initiate bills on supply, cannot initiate money bills. And this was a clear taxation bill. And it seemed to me that the appropriate check on that, or the appropriate response on that kind of legislation, was not from the Senate, but from the people. That when the government creates regimes of taxation, they must pass, if they can pass muster in Parliament, they must then pass muster with the people themselves. And very often, taxation regimes take a while to come into force and to show their effect. And therefore, if there is a period between their implementation and an election, the public has an opportunity to judge whether this was good policy or not, and that was appropriate. And so in my view, I thought it was quite inappropriate for the Senate, on partisan basis, to decide they weren't going to pass this legislation. But fortunately, the Prime Minister, as I say, used that provision, increased the number of Conservative senators, and it passed. But the interesting thing was that this whole episode really elevated the role of the Senate and elevated the controversy in the eyes of the Canadian public. And many people were very critical of the Prime Minister. They thought that this was somehow kind of a cheap shot, that he was using this opportunity to appoint more senators, and that was a bad thing, even though the law clearly states that once they're appointed, you have to wait for the erosion or the attrition of the numbers back to the original levels as it's set out in the Constitution before you can appoint any more. But what really struck me, because I did a lot of speaking on this issue at the time, as I say, because of my portfolio, was how many people did not understand that the Senate could defeat the legislation of the House of Commons. How many Canadians assumed that the House could repass the legislation, that this wasn't the final, so they didn't understand why more senators had to be appointed, because they really did not understand the mechanics. They did not understand the power that the Senate of Canada had to defeat legislation coming from the House of Commons. And so, at that time, this began to create a much greater awareness of the actual functioning of the Senate, and it created a controversy. And at the same time, of course, after the failure of the Meech Lake Accord, the issue of Senate reform became much more salient. It was pushed as part of the Reform Party's EE Senate initiative in the next round of constitutional discussions. And again, as a battle-scarred veteran of those constitutional wars, after Meech Lake, the idea was, well, you know, Meech Lake was only addressing one problem, therefore we needed to have a constitutional approach to constitutional amendment that would address many problems. This was a recipe for disaster, but it was the response to this notion that Meech Lake was just focusing on Quebec. And Senate reform became part of that agenda. The issue persists, and the recent Supreme Court of Canada references make clear that the Government of Canada cannot unilaterally alter the Senate, save for removing the property requirement. I think that is something that they could move ahead on. And so the real question is, what, if anything, should be done about the Senate? How to reform the Senate? And I think the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is the purpose of the Senate? Do we need a Senate? The House of Lords, which is perhaps the most closely related body to our Senate, has defined the purposes of that body as to consider and revise legislation, to scrutinize the executive, and to debate and report on public issues. And the Senate of Canada has a very similar set of purposes set out in a government committee report in 1980. The role of the Senate was defined as revising legislation, playing an investigative role, having a regional representative role, and a protector of linguistic and other minorities role. Now, the concerns about the Senate relate to three primary things, I suppose. First of all, the lack of accountability. And when we were dealing with the GST and the stalemate in the Senate and the need to appoint new senators, that was the thing that bothered me. I felt here is a group of people who are totally unaccountable, who do not have to answer for what they have done. And I found that very, very concerning. Secondly is the concern about the regional imbalance. Does the allocation of Senate seats now really match modern Canada, the modern population? Should we add more senators in different regions? Should there be a redrawing of those boundaries? That, of course, is incredibly difficult. And thirdly, the question, is it politically redundant? Do we need a Senate? Is this something that is useful to us, or should we simply become a unicameral legislature at the federal level as we are at the levels of the provinces? Because remember that most of the provinces at one point did have legislative councils that they eventually got rid of. So unicameralism has become the model throughout Canada, except at the national level. Well, what are some of the possible solutions to dealing with these concerns raised about the Senate and whether in fact it is important? Some people argue that the Senate should be abolished. They do not accept that all of these functions are necessary. They believe that all of the things that the Senate does can in fact be done by a unicameral legislature, that the Senate doesn't add anything. I think the Senate amends about 12% of the bills that go through it, so it certainly does have some impact. But those who argue for abolition would like to see that all done in the House of Commons. It is not surprising, perhaps, that the NDP favors this position for the simple reason, I mean, I'm sure they have many highly principled reasons, but certainly if they ever formed a government, they would find themselves looking at a Senate that did not have any New Democratic Party members, and there would be an enormous need for those members of the Senate to find a way of defining their responsibility under the conventions of the Canadian Constitution, not to stymie the legislation of a fairly elected government. But also, I think Prime Minister Stephen Harper favors abolition as his most preferred outcome. I think I'm correct in that, that he favors abolition, if I'm not mistaken. The problem, of course, everybody says is, well, what about the Supreme Court of Canada reference, which says you can't do this without invoking the unanimity provisions of the Constitution for amendment? And the assumption is that Quebec certainly would be a sticking point. I think the Premier of Saskatchewan has already said that he would be prepared to vote for abolition of the Senate, but he's the only one, I think, who's come forward to say that. So, but the real question is, if you really want to abolish the Senate, it seems to me that you need to create a constituency for that. And the question is, what role has the Senate played in protecting Quebec's interests, if we think Quebec would be the hardest nut to crack in a constitutional amendment? And I think there are some really interesting arguments you could make that the abolition of the Senate might actually work to the advantage of separatists, because if the federal government is confined to the House of Commons, and as the House of Commons grows, because populations move elsewhere, it makes a very nice case for the separatists to make that Quebec is becoming less and less important in the federal government, and therefore they must create their own country. But the question of, I mean, the assumption is that that's a non-starter, that it's not going to happen. And, you know, my reaction is, well, maybe that's the case. But if you could make a case for the fact that the Senate really is no longer necessary, that you could argue and do by looking at its activities and say there is nothing in what the Senate has been doing that really impacts on the powers of the provinces over and above how they are represented in the House of Commons, that could be a starting point for an argument. Then the government could perhaps make a case by sharing the savings from abolition of the Senate with the provinces. If running the Senate is about $90 million, well, I think in 2011 it was calculate about $90 million a year, say we round it up to $100 million a year, maybe the government of Canada could say, well, if you'll agree to abolish the Senate, we'll split the difference with you for the next 25 years. You'll get the savings from abolishing the Senate that you can have to spend as you want. I don't know. I'm just suggesting that rather than saying, well, it cannot be done, I think one has to think strategically, how might one create a case for abolition of the Senate that would get provincial support? What might be the issues that would be important to them? Because now, if you can argue that, in fact, the Senate has played a crucial role in protecting certain kinds of regional interests, that would be a different issue. But I'm not sure that that's really the case anymore. Secondly, and the thing that I have favored the most, is the notion of redefining the Senate's powers. And this could help to address some of the accountability issues. The House of Lords since 1907 has had a suspensory veto that was for 3 sessions, that was 2 sessions. So in a sense, they can suspend the application of legislation for 2 parliamentary sessions, even if they don't actually, they can't veto it, they can't defeat it. And they have no power to initiate bills of supply. We could create a suspensory veto. In other words, instead of the Senate having the power to defeat legislation, you could have the power to delay it for a particular period of time. And it would have to be a period of time that would be sufficiently inconvenient as to create an incentive for the government to negotiate with the Senate on amendments or things that would help to speed up the application or the implementation of the bill. But amending the powers of the Senate, I think, is another approach to dealing with some of the things that seem to be wrong with it. Or the House of Commons could be permitted to override a Senate veto of legislation. There could be some way that would, in some ways, not remove the power from the Senate, but make it less dramatic than it is now. And certainly in the days when we were dealing with the question of the GST, I felt very much that that was the route that should be taken. And I think in the mid-1980s, when John Crosbie was the Justice Minister, there actually was an agreement among provincial premiers to make that change, but it was never pursued. They didn't go ahead with it. The third and very popular approach to the Senate is the idea of having an election. And this would certainly also deal with the accountability problem, but it would also create some other issues. When the House of Lords looked at the question of electing the House of Lords, they defined some advantages and some disadvantages. The advantages, they said, would be legitimacy, that obviously if the House of Lords was elected, things that they did would be recognized as legitimate. The status of members might be improved and they would have specific and important duties. It would be an advantage in terms of representation, that would be direct linked to people who chose them. It might have a positive impact on the age of the House of Lords, that more young people would become part of that body. And it would also result in an entrenched bicameralism. It would certainly change the structure of the British Parliament in a way that would be very clearly of a bicameral nature. And they call that as possibly one of the advantages. But on the disadvantages, they talk about the conflict with the House of Commons and its own electoral mandate. A loss of independence and ex officio membership. Could have a disadvantage in terms of age, that perhaps you'd have people who were too young. Also, you'd have a body that was composed of simply politicians. There would be transitional difficulties, higher costs, and loss of diversity. And I want to look at this issue very importantly, because when we talk about an elected Senate, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would do it as the Australians do, where people would simply run in a general election. There could be some form of indirect election. But one of the things that I think really it characterizes some of the strongest advantages of our Senate is the fact that there are people in the Senate who are not politicians, and people who have great skills. And I think of Senator Banks, who's a wonderful musician and represents a part of our country that's very important. And I'm married to an artist, and I think the arts are incredibly significant and integral to our national life. And having the voice of an artist in the Senate, I think, is very important. But there are many walks of life where people don't necessarily want to run for election, want to be politicians. It's not in their character, and yet when they become part of the Senate, they perform extremely well. So there are certain kinds of walks of life, certain kinds of experiences, certain kinds of activities that are enormously valuable in that house of sober second thought, in that chamber where people are looking to revise legislation, think about it, improve it, or do the investigatory work, to do the studies, the reports on different areas of public policy. And the really interesting question is, could you preserve that if you had an elected Senate? Would you be able to have that kind of richness, that kind of diversity in the upper chamber if you went to a totally elected mode? Would you not simply be replicating the same pattern that you have in the House of Commons? And again, being an elected member of a parliament is, a kind of an interesting thing. I have held elected office at all three levels of government in this country. And it can be a fractious exercise. And there is something about the Senate. When President Kennedy came to speak to our parliament many decades ago, he made the comment when looking at our senators and saying that they had the sort of the contented and happy looks of people who knew they would never again have to face the slings and arrows of an electorate. But I think that this is something that one has to seriously think about. What would be the qualitative change, and what would be lost if we created an elected Senate? And people have talked about, well, we can get, bring in people from, the Order of Canada. And then there's no question that Canada is full of wonderful people who have done amazing things and have things to offer. The question is, how do we get them, if we think that they have a value in our parliamentary process, as part of the way of looking at what we do in making public policy and passing legislation and making the rules by which Canadians live? How is the best way to get them there? And would an elected Senate accomplish that? Fourthly, is it possible to have a nonpartisan Senate? I think that's very hard to do if the Senate has real power. And if it doesn't have real power, why would anybody want to do it? You could possibly run on an independent basis if there was no effect on the executive. But what is very interesting is, in my youth, when I was a political science professor, I taught American government. And if you look at the development of the American Republic, like many other countries, the founding fathers of the United States, hated faction, and they wanted to create a political system that would not depend on political parties. And there's no mention of political parties anywhere in the American Constitution. But what they soon discovered was they could not make Congress work without parties. Political parties are essential bodies for organizing legislative processes and for giving voters choice. It's all very well to say, well, we'll all want to be independents. But if I run, if I ask you to vote for me as an independent, and you have no idea how I'm going to take your views and connect them with other people, how I'm going to be able to deliver on some kind of legislative agenda to change public policy, then it's really kind of useless. What political parties do is they provide the basis for people to give a mandate. And it's messy and it's not precise, but it is an integral part of the way political bodies have come to operate. I was amused when Justin Trudeau said that the Liberal senators were not going to be, part of the Liberal caucus, which was, I guess, quite a shock to them. But the fact of the matter is, if he ever leads a government in this country, he will need the Liberal senators to caucus, because the Senate has power. It has power, and it needs to pass legislation. And if he wants to just leave it and say, oh, well, we won't worry about the Senate, they'll just, a bunch of independents, and they'll figure it out, and I'm sure they'll do their best. Well, surprise, surprise, they won't. I talked to Senator Nancy Ruth, who was originally appointed as an independent of the Senate. And she said that she found it very difficult, that she eventually decided to caucus with the Conservatives. She felt she wasn't as effective as she could have been. So I think this dream that we sometimes have, that we can do away with the messy elements of politics, that we will create this kind of serene body where there's no faction. Welcome to generations of people who have thought about democracy and hoped for that. But the reality is that we need the bases on which people can organize, represent what they are going to be about, and give people choices. A Triple E Senate would without question weaken the House of Commons. You could use the Australian model, but that has a lot of problems. I say it would weaken the House of Commons and that it would be a competition for it. Once you have elected people, they have a whole different basis of legitimacy. I think Senate reform needs to start from the question of what we want the Senate to do. Do we want it to do anything? Is there value in what it does? Not since 1984 has the Senate been what Hugh Segal, recently just retired from the Senate, used to refer to as the taskless thanks. Right from 1984, our senators were working very hard and had to obey the whip and come because they were working in support of a government that did not have a majority in the Senate. And I think since then, the Senate has been quite demanding on all of its members. It may have been very demanding before, but there wasn't quite the same political risk or problem because the Senate was working collaboratively and quite happily with the government and the party in power. Have we lost sight of the utility of the Senate? There was a very interesting Toronto Star article just a couple of years ago that talked about the Senate as really now our only source of parliamentary expertise. It said that the members of Parliament do not have the time to develop the kinds of legislative and policy expertise that members of the Senate are able to create. They're not running for election, they serve longer, and they have a chance to get into the very important work of the committees in the Senate and develop the kind of expertise that's extremely useful to us. We could, of course, create fixed terms for the Senate. Again, looking at the House of Lords, there was a suggestion of a term of 15 years. You could say, you serve for 15 years or until you reach 75, whichever comes first. And if not election, we could certainly revise the appointment process. There are right now 3 types of checks and balance in Canadian government. The first is the courts. The courts balance based on the constitutionality of legislation. That's the primary basis on which the courts balance what governments want to do by judging and evaluating legislation. There is always also what we often forget, one of the most important checks and balances on the activity of government, and that is the electorate, the process of a general election. Governments make policy, they put their ideas forward, they implement them, and at the end of the day, it's up for the public to decide whether they like that or not. And they can defeat governments, and they do. The third type of check and balance has been the Senate. And ideally, the Senate should be the check and balance on policy and mandate issues. That I think it is reasonable for the Senate to look at legislation that comes before it and ask the question, is this a piece of legislation or policy that the government has a mandate to perform? Is this a piece of public policy that is workable? If not, can we suggest amendments? The Prime Minister Harper doesn't really like the Senate, but when he led a minority government, the Senate killed a climate change bill that his minority government couldn't stop. And one of the arguments was that it was a piece of legislation that was really unworkable. and designed that the majority of members in the opposition in the House of Commons passed it to embarrass the governing party. So at that time, in fact, the willingness of the Senate to defeat a bill was very helpful to the Prime Minister. But there will never be a situation where everybody's going to be happy every day with the way the various sources of power in our government work. Democracy is a blunt instrument. It is not a precision tool. No government wants to be overturned in its legislature either by the Senate or the courts. Nobody wants that. And the Supreme Court of Canada, the majority of its appointees are appointed by the sitting Prime Minister. He's not always happy with their decisions. You know what? That's the way a democratic system works. There are no guarantees. All there are institutions that we try to understand and make work as well as we possibly can. I think the Senate may have been right about the free trade agreement and forcing an election. It was time almost to call it an election anyway. It was 4 years into the government's mandate. I think it was wrong about the GST. I think that was a partisan misuse of the power of the Senate because I think it was appropriate for the GST to be implemented. And incidentally, at that time, one of the problems was that it needed to be passed because the Canadian businesses had redone all of their catalogs and were ready to go, and if we didn't get the bill passed, it would have been hugely costly. But it was for the people of Canada to decide whether they approved that policy. And it is very interesting that many years later, the goods and services tax is still the law of the land because there was nothing ideological or partisan about it. It was the best of a series of unhappy responses to a broken tax system. In other words, the need to replace the old federal sales tax. But the question is, how prophylactic should the Senate be? How much should the Senate intervene to save us from ourselves? And there needs to be a culture of understanding what the appropriate role of the Senate is. And I think it has an appropriate role. I also think that it is important not to put onto the Senate all of the problems we have with our parliamentary democracy. When I ran for the leadership of my party, I put out a document about reforms that I wanted to make in the way we used parliamentary power. In my view, I felt we used the whip much too much. One of the things I observed as a legislator was that backbenchers on the government side of the House often had a hard time demonstrating to their constituents how hard they were working in expressing the views of those constituents. And I used to make a point when I went out to people's ridings of saying, you know, I know you don't like, especially in Alberta, I know you don't like my gun control legislation, and I want you to know that your member of parliament had her teeth in my ankles the whole time and fought very hard against it. She didn't win the argument, but she did what you asked her to do. And it's very hard. We have made it much more rigid, much more controlled, much more centralized. And I think that the price we pay is cynicism and lack of confidence in the parliamentary process, because it's not nearly, well, I can't speak for it now, I'm not in the government, but certainly when I was in Parliament, members of Parliament on the government side were very active in advocating for their constituents and very active in fighting government policies that they didn't like, but the norm was that it should be done behind closed doors. And I think, but what was interesting when I put forward this quite extensive proposal of changes and how to use Prime Ministerial power, and it was actually quite radical. I had a press conference in a group like this, and I talked about it and gave it, and then one of the journalists said, yeah, but what do you really stand for? And the point I want to make is that process is not sexy. People who cover politics have no interest in process, and yet we know of the indivisible link between form and function. How we organize things has an enormous impact on what the outcomes of those processes are going to be. So I'm quite sure that many of you will come up with processes and recommendations in the course of tomorrow of bold and dramatic ways of changing the Senate. But I want you to think a little bit about what that really means in terms of how those bodies work and the human beings who will be part of them, and what it is that we need to give to Canadians, and where the problems really lie, which are not always necessarily in the Senate. Last Sunday I was in New York, and I attended a performance of a play called The Audience, starring Helen Mirren. It's a play about Queen Elizabeth II and the relationship she has with her prime ministers that she meets in the audiences. And my husband was producing a play with her husband, so it was really great. We got to go and sit right up close, and it was wonderful. But at the end of this play, the adult Queen Elizabeth says to her younger self, For all the problems that the monarchy faces, our biggest allies are my prime ministers, because our prime ministers don't want an elected president meddling in things. And I think it's often very easy for people to say, oh, we want to have this, and let's have a Triple E Senate, and won't that be great? But what about the people in the House of Commons? How will that affect them? I can remember when I was Justice Minister and working on the possibility of creating a federal ombudsman, and how many members of Parliament were very offended by this. We are the ombudsman, they said. That's our job. When people have a problem with the government, they should come to us. Now, it may be that they can't perform that function in all ways, and there is a room for an ombudsman. But it's very easy for us to get dewy-eyed about some new possibility that is going to enable us to ignore the reality of the messy, inchoate, but nonetheless human and important institution that we're already working with. So I encourage you to be bold about Senate reform, but I also encourage you to be realistic. And when you think of Senate reform, to see the Senate in its broad context. And maybe one of the boldest things one can say about Senate reform is that there isn't a whole lot that needs to be changed. Maybe some of the powers are greater than they need to be. Maybe we can find more imaginative ways of drawing on the best of Canadians. But there is a value that it brings to our public life. And if we're really unhappy about our political process, maybe we should look at reform of the House of Commons. Anyway, I leave it to you. Thank you.